Imagine being completely alone in the freezing wilderness, no food, no fire, no way to call for help. The nights are brutal, the hunger unbearable, and every step could be your last. This is the true story of a man who spent 38 days lost in the forests of Maine, surviving on whatever he could find, battling the elements, and walking 200 miles to freedom. A fight against nature. A fight against time. And most of all, a fight to stay alive. 38 days lost. The man who walked out of the wild. A true survival epic. Chapter 1. Into the Wilderness. The morning air smelled of damp earth and pine needles as Jonathan Hayes shouldered his pack and adjusted the rifle sling across his back. The sky above the Maine wilderness was a crisp, cloudless blue, the kind of autumn morning that made him grateful to be outside. This was supposed to be a solo hunting trip, a weekend of silence and solitude before winter buried the land in snow. Jonathan had been hiking these woods since he was a boy. He knew the trails, understood the wildlife, and had no fear of getting lost. He was wrong. At noon, after several hours of tracking deer, Jonathan stopped on a ridge to check his map. The sun was lower than he expected. He really been walking that long? The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the bare branches. It carried the unmistakable scent of oncoming rain, and within minutes, the sky darkened, the first heavy drops splattering against the dried leaves. "Damn," Jonathan muttered, pulling his hood up. He turned back the way he came, following what he thought was his own trail. But something was off. The familiar landmarks, the boulder shaped like a bear's head, the fallen birch, split clean in half, were gone. He walked faster, scanning the ground for his boot prints, but the rain had erased them. The trees pressed in around him, their dark trunks stretching endlessly into the mist. His heartbeat quickened. Jonathan Hayes was lost. Chapter 2. The first days, a battle against the cold. Jonathan refused to panic. He took a slow breath, exhaling steam into the cold air. Panicking gets people killed. He had read enough survival stories to know that much. Stay calm. Think. He pulled out his map and compass, angling them under the dimming light. If he had been tracking deer eastward, then turning around should have sent him west, back toward camp. But nothing around him looked familiar. The rain was turning to sleet, the temperature dropping fast. He needed shelter. Jonathan climbed a small ridge, his boots slipping on the wet leaves, and spotted a rock overhang, not much, but enough to keep the worst of the weather off him. He hiked toward it, his stomach tight with unease. Inside, he cleared the ground of damp debris, layering pine boughs as insulation before sitting down, pulling his jacket tight. His rifle, his hunting knife, and a small bag of food, that was all he had. He hadn't packed for an extended stay. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a sound so unnatural it sent a shiver down his spine. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He wasn't that lost. Tomorrow, he'd retrace his steps. Everything would be fine. Day 2, everything was not fine. The storm had passed, but the world had changed. Jonathan emerged from the rock shelter to a landscape buried under a thin layer of ice. His boots crunched as he walked, his breath coming in quick, nervous puffs. The trail he had followed yesterday, gone. No footprints, no markers, nothing. He swallowed hard. The smartest thing to do would be to stay put and wait for rescue. His family would notice he was missing. But would they? His plan had been to hunt alone for a few days, maybe a week. No one expected him back yet. He checked his supplies. Water? Plenty for now. Food? Maybe 3 days worth. Shelter? That had to change. The nights were brutal in Maine this time of year, and the cold was more dangerous than anything else. Jonathan needed fire. He spent the next few hours collecting dry wood, using his knife and a rock to create sparks. It took forever, but when a tiny flame flickered to life, relief flooded him. As the fire crackled, sending smoke curling into the gray sky, Jonathan told himself again, I am not that lost. But deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. Chapter 3. Starvation and Desperation. By day 4, Jonathan knew he was in trouble. His 3 days' worth of food had been stretched as far as possible at any portions, chewed slowly, but now his pack was empty. Hunger changed things. It made him slow, irritable, lightheaded. It made his thoughts wander in dangerous directions. The cold? That was bad. But starvation? That was worse. He needed to find food now. Jonathan moved carefully through the trees, scanning for anything edible. He ripped bark from a pine tree, chewing the soft inner layer bitter, but technically food. Then, he spotted a patch of cattails near a half-frozen creek. Edible. He waded into the freezing water, hands shaking as he yanked out the roots, his breath coming in ragged clouds. They were starchy, tough, but they would keep him alive. Jonathan sat on a fallen log, gnawing on a raw root, his stomach twisting from the taste. He needed real food. And then, as if the forest itself had heard his desperation, he spotted a porcupine. Slow, clumsy. He could kill it. Jonathan's grip tightened around his hunting knife. His heart pounded. This was the momentous first real chance at survival. He lunged, swinging with everything he had. The rock connected, the porcupine staggered, and before it could react, Jonathan drove his knife deep. The kill was messy. Blood soaked into the snow. The smell was awful. But when he cooked the meat over the fire, the first real food he had in days, Jonathan almost cried. It was tough, gamey, and tasted like burned leather. But it was life. For the first time in days, he felt strong again. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. Jonathan woke up to the sound of his own teeth chattering. The fire had burned out, and the cold had sunk deep into his bones. His fingers were numb, his toes stiff inside his damp boots. He had slept curled up under a pile of pine branches, but it wasn't enough. He was freezing to death. Stumbling to his feet, he rubbed his hands together, trying to force warmth into them. His breath came in short, sharp bursts each. Exhale, a reminder that he was still alive. He had to move. Jonathan slung his pack over his shoulder and started walking south. At least, he thought it was south. His compass was gone lost somewhere in the last few days. Or had it been longer? His mind was slipping. Every step felt like lifting concrete blocks. His legs burned. His head swam. He had lost so much weight this spell barely held his pants up, and his ribs pressed against his skin. By day 22, the hallucinations started. He saw figures in the trees. A man in a red flannel shirt standing between two birch trees, watching him. A woman's voice calling his name soft, distant, almost like a whisper through the wind. His mother? Jonathan stopped walking. His legs trembled beneath him. Mom? His own voice sounded weak, far away. The trees did not answer. He shook his head violently, forcing himself to focus. He was dying. Jonathan took a step forward, then another. And then the world tilted sideways. The ground was suddenly beneath him, above him, everywhere. He was falling. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. His body slammed into rocks, rolling down into the darkness of a ravine. He felt something crack his ribs, his wrist. Everything hurt. Then, stillness. The only sound was his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. Jonathan lay there, unable to move, staring up at the sky. For the first time in over 3 weeks, he wondered if this was it. If this was where he died. And then a sound. Distant. Faint. A river? A highway? Civilization? Summoning every ounce of strength, he rolled onto his hands and knees. He had to keep going. Chapter 5 to 200 miles to freedom. Jonathan's entire body screamed in pain. His ribs ached with every breath, his left wrist throbbed, and his legs felt like they weren't even his anymore. But none of it mattered, because he had heard something. The sound was faint, carried on the wind something unnatural in the wilderness. Water. Moving water. A river meant fish. Civilization. A way out. Jonathan forced himself to stand, every muscle resisting. His vision swam, his balance was off, but he started walking toward the sound. One step at a time. His boots were falling apart, his toes poked through the front of one. His jacket, once thick and warm, was now a shredded mess of dirt and blood. He barely noticed. Time blurred. He walked for hours, maybe days. His mind drifted in and out, his thoughts tangled between reality and hallucination. But then there it was. A river. Wide. Cold. Alive. Jonathan dropped to his knees on the bank, scooping water into his mouth with shaking hands. The cold burned his throat, but he drank anyway. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. For the first time in weeks, he had direction. Rivers lead somewhere. Jonathan followed it, stumbling south, using his knife to dig for roots and strip bark when his stomach screamed for food. The days stretched on. His legs grew weaker. His vision dimmed. He lost track of time. Then, one morning, as the sun rose over the frozen trees, he saw it. A dirt road. A mailbox. Jonathan collapsed onto the gravel, unable to take another step. The last thing he remembered was the sound of a car's tires skidding to a stop, a voice shouting, and then darkness. Epilogue. A life forever changed. Jonathan woke up in a hospital bed. The first thing he felt was warmth. A thick blanket, the steady beep of a heart monitor, the distant murmur of voices. He had made it out. Doctors told him he'd lost nearly 50 pounds. His body was starved, dehydrated, frostbitten. He had wandered nearly 200 miles, crossing state lines into New Hampshire. They said it was a miracle he was alive. Jonathan never returned to the woods without a compass, a fire starter, and a way out. He still loved the wilderness, but now he knew the forest could kill you if you weren't ready. Would you have survived? Tell us in the comments. And if you love true survival stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more incredible tales.